Russia has huge problems with Belarus, problems that completely derailed their plans to take over Ukraine in February 2022. Belarus doesn't want to attack Ukraine. To try to uncover the reason for why Belarus doesn't want to attack Ukraine, we need to understand Alexander Lukashenko, and in attempting to consider the battlefield as he sees it. While Lukashenko has partnered with Russian President Vladimir Putin in the past, this has shown to be an uneasy alliance, one where neither side appears fully ready to trust one another, but also one where both are willing to go to great lengths to protect each other. This gives us insight, when paired with a Belarusian perspective on the war in Ukraine, on why they don't want to attack Ukraine alongside Russia. Let's start with Europe's last dictator himself, President Alexander Lukashenko. A believer in communist and Soviet principles, began his tenure as president of Belarus in 1994. Since then, he has reigned as Europe's last dictator, a title he proudly wears. Lukashenko shared the love for the Soviet Union that his Russian peer Vladimir Putin did. He would address the Russian State Duma in 1994, proposing the Union of Slavic States. This would lead to the 1999 signing on the creation of a union state with President Boris Yeltsin, which opened the door for greater cooperation between Belarus and Russia. Despite this, Lukashenko has differed with Yeltsin's successor, Vladimir Putin, on where the power of this union should be centered, whether in Moscow, Minsk, or shared between the two as equal partners. His time as president would be marked by separation from the rest of Europe and the suppression of dissent from the Belarusian media. He would maintain power through several election cycles. Each would bring more questions on the legitimacy and validity of the elections themselves. In 2014, the Maidan Revolution would turn Ukraine over from pro-Russia President Viktor Yanukovych to pro-Western leader Petro Poroshenko. This instability allowed Russia an opportunity to annex Crimea and parts of Donbass in southeast Ukraine. Initially, Lukashenko wasn't involved in the conflict, but he would host negotiations for ceasefire between Russia and Ukraine in Minsk. The ceasefire would not hold and would see a renegotiation in 2015, also in Minsk, but co-brokered with France and Germany. For the time being, it appeared as if Lukashenko had planted himself as not just some Russian stooge, but instead as a leader for peace in Eastern Europe. In an attempt to garner goodwill, Lukashenko would also free a number of political prisoners and allow international observers into Belarus. Lukashenko, by this point, Europe's final dictator, was showing a successful track as dictator. This would all change, along with everything else, in 2020 when the COVID pandemic struck. When the pandemic hit, Lukashenko would handle it poorly, often refusing to acknowledge its very existence in Belarusian borders. This may have been the straw that broke the camel's back. That year, the largest protest since the collapse of the Soviet Union swept across Belarus. Thousands were arrested, and legitimate questions rose over whether Lukashenko would manage to hold on to power. As the protests unfolded, a strange moment would occur where the Belarusian KGB arrested several suspected members of the Russian-backed private military group Wagner in Minsk. They alleged these members were in Minsk to assist with a coup attempt. Ukraine would demand these members be extradited to Ukraine for sentencing, but Belarus would ultimately extradite them back to Russia. Russia would then offer to send troops to help Belarus quell the protests, and would assist with intelligence support from the FSB. After months of protests, Lukashenko won yet another term as president, despite the same concerns of interference and manipulation as past election cycles. This firmly planted him as dictator for life in Belarus. With his new term in office and the extension of presidential authority, Lukashenko would yet again find himself at a point of friction between the West and Russia. In 2021, refugees from Syria and Iraq, displaced as a result of fighting and in search of safety in Europe, would be used as pawns by Lukashenko and Putin in what would become a migrant crisis along Belarus's border with Poland. This crisis would reveal that Belarus, along with the help of Russia, had offered to assist these refugees gain safety in Europe. Through a variety of offers, from false tourism advertisements to assurances of asylum in Europe, all using Russia as a trafficking route, Belarus was able to move thousands of refugee families to the border of the Baltic states and Poland. While doing this, Lukashenko threatened to flood Europe with drugs and migrants. In doing this, Lukashenko would firmly lose any favor he had held on to after the 2020 protests with the West, instead opting for closer and closer ties with Russia and Vladimir Putin. His friendship with Russia would soon be tested though, as 2021 faded into 2022, and the true intentions of his friend to the east revealed itself. As Belarus threatened Europe with refugees, Russia built its forces along its border with Ukraine. Russia would send a large contingent of forces to Belarus, along with potentially nuclear weapons, after a change in the Belarusian constitution would allow such a move. In February 2022, Russia attacked Ukraine, with its main effort being from Belarus. The goal of this group was to seize the capital of Kiev and decapitate the Ukrainian government, transitioning it back to a pro-Russian regime, potentially with the help of familiar face Viktor Yanukovych. Lukashenko, now in a difficult position, faced challenging decisions. It was clear that Russia was depending on the help of Belarusian forces in the initial phases of the invasion. However, it was also perfectly clear that members of the Belarusian military from all elements were not interested whatsoever. Furthermore, the Belarusian population, which had only so recently made its voice heard on other matters, was overwhelmingly against joining the fight. To enter the war, Lukashenko may be assisting his uneasy ally Putin, but he would be exposing himself to tremendous risk, not only of military failure and the external pressures from opponents that brings, but also from internal pressure. These are not risks that one takes to stay Europe's last dictator. And so, while the war raged on in Ukraine, and Vladimir Putin would suffer loss after loss, and the Russian military would be turned back even across the Belarusian border, Lukashenko would not send help. He would instead offer for other forms of military assistance, like transferring military equipment to Russia and allowing Russia to use Belarusian airfields and bases to stage and launch attacks. Even after the battle for Kiev, when Russia would pivot to instead focus on holding the territory it had taken in early 2022, Belarus would play host to Russian artillery, which would hit Ukrainian cities. Lukashenko is still not completely safe. While he has thus far refused to allow his military to be sent to Ukraine on behalf of Russia, he still faces the same domestic pressures he faced before the war. He faces those pressures, though, with a new pressure from the east. His friend Vladimir Putin, who shared the same love for the Soviet Union as he did and who had helped him hold on to power through the 2020 protests, has not had the full commitment of help from Lukashenko. Lukashenko, who has remained in power through multiple seasons of crises, faces yet another difficult decision. Does he help his uneasy friend and ally attempt to rebuild the Soviet Union by bringing Ukraine to heel, or does he protect his own seat in power, potentially forsaking the Soviet dreams he once held, losing one of his only allies in the process? Even if he helps his ally, would it be enough to ensure that Russia wouldn't attempt to subvert Lukashenko in favor of someone more easy to manage from Moscow later? These questions only get more complicated for Lukashenko when viewing the battlefield from his perspective. While Belarus has had years of close partnership with the Russian military through exercises like Zapad, this partnership appears to be at an inflection point. Most of the Russian soldiers who participated in Zapad were contract soldiers. Contract soldiers who have since been deployed to Ukraine and have suffered egregious losses. What's left in Belarus is a contingent of what some estimates have had at 20,000 troops, at this time mostly comprised of mobilized troops who do not have the professional experience or discipline that their contract predecessors had. These troops can come and go through Belarus as they please, without needing the Belarusian government's approval thanks to constitutional changes. In effect, Belarus is in a state of light occupation, where Russia has a significant troop presence and is able to move freely, but Belarus is still able to exercise its autonomy to some degree. The Belarusian military, on the other hand, is much less capable than their Russian counterparts, at least at the start of the war. Lukashenko knew this, and knew that if he really wanted to get involved in the war with Ukraine, he would have to execute a mobilization similar to what Putin reluctantly executed over the summer. This appears to be what he did, albeit quietly. Civilians with prior military experience, as well as anyone with medical experience, have been called up to refresh their skills. Even with this quiet mobilization, Belarusian civilians would remain overwhelmingly against the prospect of joining the war. With the 2020 protests being so recent, Lukashenko knows that he has to tread carefully. Still, even with a quiet mobilization, if Belarus were to join Russia in the war, the equipment shortages and needs mean losses Belarus would face would be incredibly high. This too is something Lukashenko knows. He knows it because his military leadership knows it, and have gone to great lengths, including resigning from command in protest of any involvement in Ukraine. By this point, Lukashenko knows that Ukraine is battle-tested. He saw them turn the Russians back just south of his borders in Hostomel and the outskirts of Kiev. Russia's mighty VDV, as well as a reinforced armored thrust south along the Dnieper, all failed against Ukraine in the earliest phases of the war. After the attempt on Kiev failed, Lukashenko pondered his dilemma, while Ukraine Ukraine reinforced its border with Belarus. With every day and week that Lukashenko continues to ponder this problem, Ukraine has had time to ready fresh defenses for a potential Belarusian attack. This means that even if Lukashenko decided to bring Belarus into the war, whether to attack Kiev or attack further west towards Lviv in an attempt to cut off Western military aid, Belarus would have to face more prepared and organized resistance without the help of Russia's best fighting forces. It isn't just the tactical situation that has challenged Lukashenko though. This is a war he wanted to prevent back in 2015 with the Minsk agreements. In some ways, he feels this is antithetical to his vision for a unification of Slavic nations. He feels this is a battle between brothers, a battle he wants no part of. Despite this, it's a battle his only real ally left, Vladimir Putin, wants him to engage in. Vladimir Putin needs Belarus to engage, as Russia's defensive lines are tested from Kharkiv to Kherson, and challenges of stabilizing the lines with a surge of mobilized troops becomes more acute as the winter sets in. Putin needs relief. Relief that could come from an assault in the west by Belarus into Ukraine, forcing the Ukrainians to move fighting forces away from the front with Russia and over to defend the Belarusian attack. Such an attack, Putin believes, could make a difference and help Russia regain momentum in the war. Still, this does not change the position that Lukashenko finds himself in. Does he help his only real ally by assaulting a country he doesn't want his military to fight in, risking the ire of his already rowdy civilian population, or does he abstain from the war, risking the ire of his only real ally who has already demonstrated both the means and motivation to carry out regime change? Ironically, while it's Lukashenko who stands to lose a great deal, it's Vladimir Putin who stands to lose the most. Should Lukashenko ultimately choose to assist Putin in the war with direct military support, in essence by attacking Ukraine, he would be tethering his fate to Putin. Their vulnerabilities merged, their outcomes joined.